Okay. Opens up with a big net, and by the way, I want to remind you, some of these big nets you will see on the test, or at least some of you will. So keep in mind, the big net is about Nat Turner, a very important man of the time. He was a preacher who had taught himself to read against his master's wishes, but he believed that he was receiving revelations from God, and that God had told him to set up a rebellion and free the slaves. Anyway, he got 6 trusted friends to assist him. These people got together and sneaked into Nat Turner's master's right away and killed the master and the master's entire family as Nat Turner's master. Then, emboldened, they moved on to other slave-owning families, killed them, and as they did, they got more and more slaves on their side, and they got together what your notes here call an army. To me, it was really more like a riffraff, not a true army. But the whites quickly caught on to what happened, and they fought back. They formed a militia. And of course, the governments got involved, and the militia killed most of the insurrectionists. Nat Turner escaped for some 70 days, but he was found. He was tried and hung. Slave owners were thrown into terror. The Mason-Dixon line. William Penn, who did not believe in war, there was a border dispute between Pennsylvania and Maryland. So William Penn called out 2 surveyors and said, draw a line between our 2 states, and Maryland agreed. So the line is a nice straight line, and that's why Pennsylvania has a nice straight southern border between it and Maryland. Well, the Mason-Dixon line was not just a line that separated Maryland from Pennsylvania. It became the line that separated the free territory of the United States from the slave. South of the Mason-Dixon, every one of these states, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, all were slave states. By the way, Virginia, there was no West Virginia in those days, so Virginia consisted of all this territory here. It was at that time the biggest state in the East. Kentucky was a slave state, but the states north of the Ohio River were free. The states south of the Ohio River were slave. And then slavery was extending all the way westward. Missouri was a slave state. The Missouri Compromise had said that this southern border of Missouri all the way out would be slave from here on down and up here. Now, they did not realize that this territory would be smaller than this, because at the time of the Missouri Compromise, we did not have the Oregon Territory. But again, the Missouri Compromise lasted some 30 years. Now, the big difference between the North and South during the antebellum period. Now, this word antebellum, it's only used in connection with the Civil War. If you go to Stone Mountain, you'll see this word used a few places. Like here's an antebellum plantation. Here's an antebellum this, or an antebellum that. It means before the war, but it's only before the Civil War. You know, anything before World War II doesn't count. But anyway, it's only used in connection with the Civil War. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville was a Frenchman, visited the United States. He said he noticed that all the differences between Northern and Southerners revolved around slavery. De Tocqueville wondered what made the United States great, so he visited Congress and he found what he called a bunch of cheap politicians. They didn't impress him. He went to the judges. The judges did not compare to the judges in Europe. The judges in Europe were more educated and dressed better. That didn't impress him. He went to the churches. The preachers were not as educated as the preachers in Europe. The church is not impressed with it. Well, what makes America great? He finally concluded it was the home. America had strong family ties and a strong home life. And he concluded this is what made America what America is. All right. Americans after the War of 1812 pushed westward. For Southerners, they wanted more farmland. a lot of the South was planted in cotton. The South became the cotton kingdom. Most of the work of planting and harvesting the cotton was done by slaves. The slave population grew, especially, the Constitution said after the year 1808, such persons could not be brought into the United States, though the slave trade was to stop, which it did. So that meant that the only way that there could be more slaves was by natural reproduction. They could not be bought, especially no one wanted to buy slaves in the West Indies, for the reasons I've already named. In 1860, 1 in 3 Southerners were black, but in the lower South, the population of white and black were nearly equal. 2 states. The 2 states were Mississippi and South Carolina. The blacks outnumbered whites. The whites were dedicated to white supremacy, and folk, this was to even last up to more than 100 years after the Civil War. The whites became dedicated to white supremacy. It's a fact. Not that I favor it, I don't, but nevertheless, that's just a fact of life. The Southerners lived among the blacks, whom they both despised and feared. And then the abolitionists began to teach hard against slavery, and this made the Southerners realize that, hey, we live in a dangerous world. They argued about slavery. They said the Roman Empire and all the other great empires have been slave societies. The Bible condoned it, the law sanctioned it, but folks, there was one place they did not realize, one thing. Nowhere in the history of mankind was slavery so racist as it was in the Western Hemisphere up until the time that slaves were freed. In Roman times, the Romans would enslave Greeks, they would enslave Carthaginians, they would even enslave Jews when the Jews rebelled, but they also enslaved your fellow Romans. Anyone who got too deeply into debt was enslaved. So the slaves consist of people from every race the Romans came in contact with, but never was there as much racism involved as there was in slavery in the New World up until the time that slaves were freed. Now, folks, there's a lot of truth in this statement here. The Southern slave owners said, we've seen Northern factory workers, and we would not let our slaves live as badly as the Northern factory workers. Our slaves are better fed, better clothed, better housed, and receive better medical care than your Northern factory workers. And folk, in most cases, this was actually the truth. Now, it didn't justify slavery. The Northern factory workers at least could quit. They could pack up and move west, and a lot of them did. But again, and this made the Southern people justify their slavery. Hey, we don't treat our slaves as badly as you Northern factory owners treat your workers. And there was a whole lot of truth in that. Now, some whites claimed that slavery eased class war because they were saying, well, hey, every white, even the rich and poor, have this one thing in common, their white skin, and therefore they can all claim or think that, hey, we're not at the bottom, we're better than someone. In India, they had the same thing. India had a group of people called the outcasts, the lower untouchable caste. And every other Indian from the other caste could say, hey, at least we're not at the bottom. Most whites did not own slaves. They would work on small farms with the help of family members. They would marry, have a few children. When the children grew up, they would help with a farm. And this would go on for generations. The Southerner was considered a planter if he owned 20 or more slaves. If he owned less, he was just considered a farmer. Only about 12% of slave owners owned 20 or more slaves. Now, I'm not saying 12% of whites. Only 12% of few whites who did own slaves. The planters would often move westward, and when they did, again, They did not know about as much about fertilizers as we do. So they would plant the land until eventually the land did not produce anymore. They wore the land out. Then they pack up and move west. They did not know about crop rotation, or if they did, they didn't practice it. Crop rotation or fertilizers. Didn't know about any of this stuff, so they just over-cultivate the land when it wouldn't produce, pack up and move west. Take their slaves with them. Now, throughout most of the rest of the New World, particularly from the Rio Grande River all the way south, slavery was dying. It still existed in Cuba and maybe in Puerto Rico also, I'm not sure. These small islands who could not revolt against Spain because there was no place to hide. That was the same reason these islands did not revolt against Britain. But the one place that slavery did not end right away was in Brazil. But these other countries, they got their independence from Spain, then a dictator would take over, and one of the first acts the dictator did was order that slaves be freed. It was done peacefully. I was asked one time, well, if they could do it peacefully, why couldn't we? Not one of these countries had one section in it that was all slave and the rest of the country non-slave. The slaves in all these were scattered out, so there was not a matter of slaves being confined to one section in any of the countries. And also they realized that it was becoming an outmoded system, so with everybody else having to free their slaves, most people were willing to. Brazil now did not free its slaves until 1880, 15 years after we did. And their issue was they were shamed out of it, purely and simply. And I've had some students from Brazil, and they say, yeah, that's a lot of what happened. And also the slaves began to be very rebellious. And finally the Brazilian government released them. But in the southeast United States, slavery was not dying. Tobacco, cotton, sugar, and rice are the four main crops, and some of these crops involved a lot of painful stooping over that would make a person's back ache terribly, but also growing rice calls for wading in water, sometimes knee-deep, where that you would run a risk of being attacked by leeches and venomous snakes you did not see, particularly the cottonmouth water moccasin, might live in the rice paddies. But you had to grow the rice for a while with the rice paddy underwater. White people would not do that kind of work. Slaves had no choice. In the rice growing area, blacks made up 90% of the population. Had it not been for Eli Whitney and the invention of the cotton gin, slavery might have died out. Eli Whitney perhaps did not realize his invention was going to guarantee that slavery would catch hold. Cotton was easier to grow than the other crops and was grown practically everywhere in the South. And again, most of the work was done by slaves. Cotton accounted for 60% of the nation's export. That includes the whole nation, North and South. Northern middlemen became involved in the cotton trade, and they would set up warehouses. They did the shipping, they did the insurance. Then once it was insured, they would send it to English mills, and English mills would transform the cotton into yarn or into cloth and make clothing out of it. This made the Southern people say, hey, you can't fight cotton. Cotton is king. The whole world needs cotton. When the Civil War broke out, it was found that cotton could be grown in India and in Morocco. And then, of course, what really hurt, the boll weevil was to hit Southern farmers. And it took a long time before Southern farmers realized, hey, we just can't grow cotton anymore the way we used to. Your large southern cities were port cities. But the South had fewer cities in the North. European immigrants chose to go north owing to slavery. European immigrants, particularly from Ireland, from Germany, and from Great Britain and Scotland, would hit the north and rarely come south anymore. There was no public school system, so illiteracy was widespread. Something else that I don't have in the notes, hookworm. Hookworm invaded a lot of Southerners because the hookworm lives in shaded areas underground, and Southern people would go, particularly children, would go around with bare feet. There have been persons who said that the hookworm helped make the Southern people intellectually inferior. There is still hookworms around, but most of us don't go bare feet anymore, so we're not likely to get it. But if you have to go barefoot on bare ground under a tree, and again, that type of areas do not exist that much. One of my children liked going barefoot, and I tried to tell her, hey, better put shoes on. Oh yes, something else too. The Southern people would often kill all the grass in their yard, pull up the grass, because this kept the snakes out of their yard. Snakes are afraid of a wide open area. They'll pass through it, but they can't make their home there because, number one, they're too visible and they can become a meal, or because they're so visible they can't find a meal. Snakes have to find their meals by hiding. So Southern people would oftentimes have yards that had no grass, and they would sweep their yard. Go out with a broom and sweep up their yard instead of mowing. Sweep up the crud or whatever off their yard. Anyway, plantation masters would oftentimes hire overseers, and they called their relationship with the slaves paternalism. The word paternal means father. We're fathers to these slaves. They said that it was reciprocal, a good relationship between master and slave, that the white man had a duty to care for the black and the black man should not wish to be free from his responsibilities. In 1808, slave trade was closed, and masters had to replenish their slaves by allowing them to marry their children, and therefore the masters had to take care of their slaves more than they once had. Housing, food, and clothing improved for slaves, and again, as I mentioned, when the Southern people claimed that their slaves lived better than northern factory workers, this claim was, in most cases, justified. The Southern slaves were better clothed, better fed, etc., etc. Now, folk, when I was in elementary school, our teachers tried to tell us, oh no, slaves were not whipped. The few that were, they were frowned on and they were criticized severely by their neighbors. This is simply not as true as my teachers tried to make it. Our teachers also would tell us, oh, a slave husband could not be sold apart from a slave wife. Slave owners had to keep families together. This is simply not so. We don't know how much whipping was done. We do know it happened. Some slaves were castrated. Plantation owners would defend their honor. Long after the North outlawed dueling, the South still had it. And one of my wife's relatives, myself, I'm mostly a Northerner, even though my mother was a Southerner. But my wife, her ancestors were Southerners. Long after dueling was outlawed in the North, the South had it, and some of my wife's relatives in the 1830s were killed in duels. We visited one of the grave sites one time. She said, this man was killed in a duel. Now, sexual mixing of the races was common. We don't know for sure, but we do know what occurred. And here's the thing about it, folk. Everyone for miles around knew about Old Massa, knew that Old Massa was having sex relations with slave women. Everyone knew about it except for Old Miss. Old Massa was the name of the slave owner, and Old Miss was his wife. Somehow or another, Old Miss was blind, and anyone who studied psychology may know that they kept themselves blind as much as they could, even though sometimes Old Miss caught on, and this created a whole lot of friction. Old Miss could not leave. You might say, couldn't Old Miss just up and divorce him? In Southern society, among the upper classes, the slave owners for a woman who was high in Southern society to leave her high up husband, a rich husband, would have been disastrous. So the answer was she hardly could leave. A Southern lady was called an ornament. She was expected to be delicate, graceful, pious, chaste, obedient. Chivalry elevated the lady, but at the same time it subjugated her. I had a college teacher who said that Southern gentlemen protected their women from everyone except for themselves. She had duties now that required, well, she was expected to manage a household, especially since her husband was oftentimes in Washington, D.C. working as a congressman or whatever, or her husband was at the state capitol, which meant her husband was away a lot of the time, so the duties of managing fell on her. And she would have to work long, long hours managing the household. She was expected to bear children and rear them up, so her life was not a life of leisure. Every time she went somewhere, she had to have a chaperone. Again, this was to guarantee that she remained chaste. They often became lonely. They didn't have a telephone. They didn't have, they basically didn't have any close friends. The women were in their household either with their daughters or they were the slave women. And there was no other woman of their class for miles and miles around. So oftentimes they fought loneliness. Again, they had no internet, no Facebook, no telephone, nothing like that. And, okay, I heard some of you chuckle. I've heard, I don't spend much time on Facebook. I do have a Facebook account, but I've heard that it actually is more socially harmful than it otherwise would be. But nevertheless, for a person who lived the life of a slave owner, of a plantation owner's wife, they might have benefited from Facebook if they would have had it. And oftentimes they knew about the slave owners for other plantations, but they were blind as a bat to the problems of their own husbands. I forgot something, folk. All right. Slaves would build their lives outside the master. For instance, when it got dark, the slaves were pretty much on their own, and sometimes they'd go and visit slaves from other plantations. Again, in the summertime, southern summers were so hot they hardly could sleep until 1 a.m. And folk, I experienced this when I was in the National Guard camping at Fort Stewart. It would get really, really hot, and those barracks had no air conditioning and no fans. So we would suffer until finally around 1 a.m. it would get cool enough for us to sleep a little bit. Then they'd wake us up at 4 in the morning. Anyway, that's another issue. All right. The main thing slaves were for was work. They were taught to work from the time they were young. The work was hard and monotonous. Most of your slaves were field hands, but maybe one or two in 10 were household servants. The household servants were mostly female, but sometimes males were called inside the house, particularly if they thought the male was just not strong enough or getting too old to do work outside. The ones inside the house worked closer to old Massa and old Miss and didn't have any time for themselves. And these house servants sometimes received more beatings than the field hands did. Some of the men became skilled artisans. One slave in 100 was a driver. In other words, a driver was to keep the other slaves busy. And he often used a whip doing so a lot of times slaves were whipped by other slaves. All right. On Saturday afternoons they were let off, and on Sundays it was found out, the Russians found this out the hard way, you can't work people 7 days a week. They'll start falling over, they'll get sick, they'll become totally unproductive. So slaves were given Sundays off and Saturday afternoons, and during this time they lived what little life they had. The masters were hardly unaware of what was going on. But there they would gather around the campfire, tell stories. Um, and oftentimes their spouses would be sold to another plantation with the marriage breaking up. There was no law that recognized marriage among slaves. Again, this was not what I was taught, but this is what we're finding out today. Fathers did what they could for their children. White ministers would preach to slaves to obey their masters. But slaves formed their own Christianity outside their masters. Particularly, they'd get together and sing these songs known as Negro spirituals. A German preacher came to Harlem one time, many years later, before World War II, and heard the spirituals that the people in Harlem were singing. He said, "Hey, I want to teach this to my people. Put that to music." And he went back to Germany and taught his choir to sing the spirituals that he had heard in the United States. Their religion was a mixture of Christianity and African. Their music could be traced back to Africa also. Now, slaves would oftentimes sabotage their master's property. They also ran away. They would try to escape to areas where the slavery was illegal. They did not rebel outright because they pretty well knew they had no chance of success. When a rebellion was planned, slaves would often betray each other. But they would often break their master's tools. All right. I've already mentioned how the slaves would sometimes gather around the campfire. Then into this campfire would come Grandma Moses, and they all knew they'd better be prepared to go. She was not going to let any of them stay behind. She had a pistol. The free blacks almost always were in poverty. They were under numerous restrictions. They always had to carry their papers around to show they were free. And every time they just walked on a street or walked from one town to another, if a constable saw them, he'd say, "Show me your papers." They'd pull out their papers out of the pocket, and then the constable, once he looked at the papers, would let them move on. But they were highly restricted. They were looked on as being worthless. At least one of them, William Ellison, became a slave owner himself, even though he was born a slave. Others of them, black people, owned slaves. In fact, when the Civil War was over, a black man bought Jefferson Davis's his plantation because Davis could no longer keep it up. A few free blacks did prosper. You had two types of yeoman farmer, the ones that lived in the hill country. The hill country is what we today call Appalachia. The Appalachians, then there were those who lived in the flatlands, the plantation belt. The hill country was not conducive to slave type of farming. Persons who lived in the hill country would work really hard to get very little crop out of their farm. The hill country just simply was not good farmland. The flatland was much better. A lot of them grew cotton, but they could only grow about a bale or two of cotton a year. And when it came time to gin their cotton, they had to rent it or borrow it from slave-owning neighbors. Wealthier planters might help a yeoman get started, or they would help each other when one of them got sick. The yeomen were committed to white supremacy. Now, again, by any chance, have any of you ever read the comic strip about Snuffy Smith, or know who I'm talking about? He was a typical upland mountain dweller, but not in the Appalachian region, but the Ozarks. But anyway, some of these people who lived today in the Appalachian region live a lot like their ancestors did, except they have automobiles and a few things like that. But they would help build each other's barns and help each other at harvest time. I mean, at one time in our history, if you started to build a barn, the neighbors would come around from all around. They'd have a barn race, and you'd have the barn up in one day. and they'd have a house raising. They would help you raise your house also. Today, that's impossible because you have government regulations and you have to get a professional plumber to do the plumbing, a professional electrician to do the electrical work. And you have to get all kinds of inspectors to